Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. We've got a lot to cover today. Welcome and thank you everyone for joining us this morning for Coffee with the Collection. My name is Amanda and I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art. Let's get things started with a little housekeeping first. Everyone should be on mute and I'd like to ask you all to keep yourselves muted so we can hear our presenters without any distractions. But if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question during the presentation, please feel free to do so using the chat feature. To open your chat, scroll down to the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on the icon that looks like a speech bubble. Once you click that, a window will open to the side of your screen where you'll be able to type questions and comments, and we'll circle back around to those at the end of the presentation. We also have enabled closed captioning. To access that feature, just click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And now I'd like to invite everyone to sit back, relax, grab your favorite cup of coffee. Hopefully you have with you the session's special roast broadsheet blend created by our friends at Yellow Dog Coffee Company with flavors inspired by the subject of today's discussion. I'd like to introduce you all to our friend and partner, Lily Braun from Yellow Dog Coffee Company. Lily, do you mind taking just a minute or two to tell us a little bit about the roast you put together for us today?
Yeah, so it's a shame my camera's not working, or I could show you our real cute label. But our broadsheet blend it's a medium roast, roasted with our Ethiopia beans and our Tanzania peaberry beans. The Tanzania peaberry is kind of like a specialty bean that we've been able to get a hold of. So we're really excited about this. It's really delicious. So we have that available in our shop. And also, if you have been enjoying our coffee so far with the Coffee with the Collection that we've had this year, we don't have it up quite yet, but soon we are going to have a gift basket available with all of the coffees that we've put out so far. So if you have any past favorites, those will soon be coming back. So keep an eye out for that. Yeah.
That's great. That sounds perfect for the holidays coming up too.
Yes.
I love that. Well, thanks so much, Lily. I appreciate you sharing with us. A link to their website where you can purchase that roast or any others should be in the chat now if you'd like to go ahead and check them out. Without any further delay, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters for today. We are thrilled to have with us special guest Seth Prince joining the program this morning. Seth is the OU Daily's newsroom advisor, OU Student Media's assistant director, and an adjunct instructor for Gaylord College. He's an OU graduate who worked on the copy desk in news and in sports at the Oregonian for 14 years, including as part of the team that won the 2001 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. He returned to OU in 2014. Welcome to the program today, Seth. And joining Seth in conversation is the always lovely Dr. Hadley German. Dr. German is the Eugene B. Adkins Curator at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art, a position she has held for 6 years. She completed her PhD with a dissertation on art posters of the American West in spring 2022 at the University of Oklahoma. Dr. German's research interests include art, photography, fortresses of mediocrity, and the history of graphic design. Excuse me. Welcome, Hadley. But before I officially hand the reins over to you, I'd like to go ahead and acknowledge that today is Veterans Day. As someone who spent my entire childhood as an Air Force brat and most of my adult life as an Army wife, I would like to extend my heartfelt appreciation and gratitude to our military service members and their families on not just this day, but every day. From myself and on behalf of the museum, we thank you for your dedication and sacrifices for our nation. Now, some of you may or may not know, but our subject for today's discussion, Robert Rauschenberg, was also a member of the military. He served from 1944 to 46 as a neuropsychiatric technician in the Navy Hospital Corps. It is no accident that we scheduled today's session on Veterans Day as a way to honor Rauschenberg's service. There's one last thing I'd like to do before handing things over to you, Hadley. I'd like to ask our audience members a quick question that you can answer by typing into the chat window that I mentioned earlier. To get us in the right frame of mind, I would like to invite everyone to share in just a few words, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think about artist Robert Rauschenberg, if you're familiar? Are there any artworks or a particular style that comes to mind? Anyone who would like to, feel free to go ahead and type your thoughts into the chat window. And while everyone is sharing with each other, Hadley, I will now officially stop talking and hand things over to you.
Thank you, Amanda. Well, I'll let you all type your responses to what you think of when you think of Robert Rauschenberg, and I'll let you know that I'm going to provide an overview of Currents, the Currents project, from which our current exhibition, Robert Rauschenberg Pressing News, draws. And in case, for some of you, you may not be that familiar with this artist, and so I'll give a little bit of background about or context before I get into the current series. Okay. Which is actually here. I should have shown that slide next already. Okay, well, so who was Rauschenberg? He was one of the 20th century's most innovative and influential artists, known for pushing the boundaries of what was considered possible in any given medium. An incredibly prolific and creative maker of art, he possessed a restless mind and compulsion to experiment, to try and retry new ideas and new formats. He was groundbreaking in his attitude that any object, any everyday object, could serve as art. And his experimental nature is perhaps most evident in his combines. Those were works that launched his fame in the 1950s. Rauschenberg's combines are what we would call in art history assemblage. They're three-dimensional found objects collaged onto two-dimensional surfaces. In short, they merge painting and sculpture, making use of anything from tires to bed sheets to taxidermied goats, as you can see here. Rauschenberg's most famous combine, Monogram, an evolving assemblage that went through several iterations between 1955 and 1959. So this is 10 years before he creates the Currents project. In this work, a stuffed Angora goat wears a tire necklace and perches on a painted canvas, complete with a tennis ball dropping behind it. The title refers to the combining of two letter forms to create a monogram or logo. So Rauschenberg thought of the goat and this tire as kind of a form of logo or monogram. In the 1950s, such works like Monogram, earned Rauschenberg a reputation for being the art world's enfant terrible, a wild child whose works were so radical, so experimental that at the time they were even unsellable. Monogram, in fact, was rejected by the Museum of Modern Art when a collector offered to donate it to the museum shortly after it was first exhibited in 1959. It was subsequently purchased by the Modern Art Museum in Stockholm, Sweden in 1964, where it now resides. Surely MoMA regrets that decision as the one that got away. Well, throughout his career, Rauschenberg restlessly experimented with medium and scale, not only in combines and painting or sculpture, but also in printmaking. As early as 1953, 17 years before Currents, he made automobile tire print, the largest print on record, and he was constantly doing this, trying to make the biggest possible print or the biggest possible painting that had ever been produced. This 22-foot long expanse of paper was printed, if you will, by the rear tire of a Model A Ford driven through Lower Manhattan by Rauschenberg's friend, the musician John Cage. And you can see the entire expanse on the bottom and then a detail in this image on the top. So I have described Rauschenberg as radical and experimental, but by the mid-1960s, his work was also often politically or socially motivated. A variety of bad news in the late 1960s distressed the artist. The murders of MLK and Senator Robert F. Kennedy in 1968, urban riots, the Vietnam War, the My Lai massacre of Vietnamese civilians by US troops, and environmental destruction. Reeling from the world situation, his friend's personal problems, and a studio fire, things couldn't get worse, and then his studio caught on fire. In late 1969, Rauschenberg consulted an astrologer. He felt desperate. He feared his own actions were responsible for the dire news and for his friend's struggles. Well, the astrologer advised that he escape to the seashore. So fleeing New York to Malibu, California, Rauschenberg planned to paint a large, calm watercolor, a seascape, but instead he made currents. He collaged together headlines, images, and articles from at least 14 regional and national newspapers in January and February 1970. He subscribed to at least 7 national newspapers for the purpose. And these collages served as studies for 3 series of screen prints that are collectively referred to as currents. Okay. Together, they formed Rauschenberg's protest. He remarked, quote, "I decided to communicate only through the newspapers, the hot news, the kind we forget as soon as we hear it," end quote. So what you're looking at here is one of the 36 newspaper collage studies that Rauschenberg made for currents. And from these collages, he made 3 series of screen prints. First features, also surface series, and then third currents. All were printed at Styria Studio in Glendale, California. So essentially, he goes to California to escape the bad news, but ends up creating art that is not only about it, but made from it. In a sense, I think we could look at the Currents project as Rauschenberg's way of exercising the news. Okay. So at 6 feet tall by 54 feet long, a print that we don't own, the Currents print, was the largest silkscreen ever printed. It was more than double the size of his 1953 automobile tire print. Only 6 copies of that print exist, and as I said, we don't own it. It's represented in our exhibition through the 1970 exhibition catalog, where there was this fold-out insert that shows the whole, the large print. We also don't own any of the original collages for this series, but we do own features and we do own surface series. And those 2 print series comprise our exhibition, Pressing News. So features, which I have an image on the left for you. This is a series of 26 screen prints, and they're basically positives. So black ink printed on whites or pale pink or pale blue or pale yellow. It's very subtle, the background. And then surface series, which is a series of 18 prints, which consists of overlapping layers of black and white prints on a black background. And in a nod to newspaper printing, to the process of newspaper printing, Rauschenberg printed a halftone at various scales. So you can see this pattern of dots embedded into the image in surface series. So these images are a lot more complicated when you look at them up close than they might seem at a distance. So how did he make these? Well, they're screen prints. And so what you see on the top row is the transfer of a photographic image to a silk screen through a photosensitive emulsion. And then on the bottom row, the paper goes underneath the screen, ink is poured on top, and you pull the ink across the surface of the screen with a squeegee, and pressing the ink through the screen basically transfers the image onto the paper. And so the title of our exhibition, Pressing News, is a pun. It's a pun on news media, but also this process of literally pressing the news or pressing the ink through the screen. If you have questions about screen printing and this process, Amanda is a printmaker, and we can pick her brain during the Q&A. Okay, but significantly, this photo transfer process, which allows the printing of photographic images, is taught in art schools across the country today, including at OU. I learned how to do it it was probably 2001, right next door. But Rauschenberg really innovated that process. Okay, so here are 3 prints from the features group of 26 prints in Currents. And when you look close, you can notice subtle differences in printing. In this image, you can kind of see the image to the right with the pro is slightly blue. The center image with the with the marijuana plant, and the burning dollar bill is slightly pink in the background. And articles and images that appear again and again in these prints often allude to Vietnam, to politics, to environmental issues, and to sports. And then I wanted to show you, so he took the screens for features, and then he would reprint those in different orientations and overlapping in surface series. Whoops. So here you have a couple of those images, portions of the images from features, and where they show up in a couple of the images in surface series. So the fish, the dollar bill, and then I really love number 71 with the pro. I think the negative space is really beautiful on that particular print. Okay, well, what happens to these images? What happens to currents? Well, the project was finished in 1970, in early 1970. So he had completed the collages and printed them in, well, excuse me, he had created the compilation of collage material in January and February. And by April, the entire printed series was complete and on exhibit in Minneapolis. So really kind of fast turnaround. From Minneapolis, it traveled to New York and then Pasadena. And so here in these images at the lower right, you see the 54 long currents print wrapping around the walls. So that's just a portion of that print. And the original installation also included audio of news broadcasts that Rauschenberg himself selected. And the broadcasts overlap, they fade in and out. They're kind of difficult to make out. You have to strain to follow them. And they resemble an audio collage that is much like the visual collage of newspaper headlines and articles. And we are so fortunate that the Rauschenberg Foundation allowed us to borrow the audio for our exhibition. And so I'm just going to play a short clip of it so that you can get an idea of what this sounds like. But it's basically the soundtrack that Rauschenberg intended for audiences to hear as they were looking at these prints, and probably a lot louder than how loud it's going to be on this recording. Let's see.
True displays of nerve and bravery this correspondent has ever witnessed in battle. The battalion commander stayed on the highway directing his troops. Cambodians' losses were light, 1 killed and at least 2 or 3 wounded. The KO is still 30 miles away. Today's action is going to be a long and dangerous trip.
I'll skip ahead.
The crime is license. I don't know what is this year's issue in New Jersey.
Oops. You get the idea. And it's several hours of this overlapping audio, okay? So Rauschenberg's goal for this series was protest. He wanted to shake people awake, to make them see what was happening in the world. But in 1970, Currents received mixed reviews. The content of the prints was almost too familiar, too mundane, too banal for some critics who argued that he hadn't manipulated the newspaper images enough. To them, Currents seemed too much like news and not enough like art. Really, from my perspective, they missed the point. By inundating audiences with a visual and audible compilation of competing headlines and audio, Rauschenberg drew attention to both the physical discarding of the news, the literal tossing of newspaper with fish bones and vegetable peelings, and on the other hand, the emotional or the psychological discarding of the news that resulted from being inundated or surrounded by it. That psychological or emotional stupor is what, it seems to me, he sought to shake people awake from, much like he himself had been violently awakened in fall 1969, prior to his rush to the astrologer and subsequent rush to the seashore. And I kind of wonder if by subscribing to 7 or more newspapers, Rauschenberg's experience prefigured our own. His commentary seems so relevant today when our newsfeed changes by the minute and we daily navigate a deluge of bad news that bombards us from our phones, our computers, our TVs, and in print. Well, if Rauschenberg's goal for these images was protest, our goal as a museum was to show work on a simple level, was to show work from the permanent collection by an important artist that had not been on view in over a decade. In previous installations, these prints in our museum were always installed in a grid on one wall. This organization, giving them an entire exhibition, by contrast, really slows the viewer down. It encourages closer observation of the complexity within each print and of relationships across images. And it helps us to gain an understanding of the enormity of Rauschenberg's undertaking. That long stream of prints, for me, evokes the unwinding expanse of the 54-foot long print that we don't own, and of the horizontal expanse of seascape that Rauschenberg did not paint. Likewise, for me, the blue and yellow wall colors evoke the California coast. This wasn't intentional, but I think it really works. Okay. And they also, with the quotations, kind of allude to Rauschenberg's personal relationship to the project. And I find it interesting because when people visit this exhibition, you might, I think my assumption was, oh, it's newspaper. It's not going to seem personal to people. We really have to make it personal in some way so they can connect with this. But people have really a personal response to this, whether they lived through 1970 or not. And I think that the work was personal to Rauschenberg. And whether you wouldn't know this necessarily as a visitor, but even the graphics that are in the exhibition are related to that kind of aspect of the project. So Janis Joplin makes an appearance in the gallery, and she was a close friend of Rauschenberg's. They were both from Port Arthur, Texas, and her death deeply disturbed him, and that happened only months after he finished this project in 1970. Okay. Also included in the wall graphics is an astronaut, and in summer of 1969, Rauschenberg was really excited about the moon landing. He kind of had a short-lived burst of optimism around that event that then quickly dissipated in the fall. Okay. Then I just wanted to show a couple of, these are images from the learning and engagement space, which is an area where visitors can make their own collages of newspaper headlines from contemporary articles and think about our relationship to the currents running through our culture today. Okay. Well, Rauschenberg may not have altered the world situation with his currents project, but he did revolutionize fine art printing. Prior to the series, he inked untried materials from John Cage's tire to a broken lithography stone. Throughout the 1960s, he experimented with processes that allowed him to transfer photographic images to lithography stones and to silkscreens. And following currents, he created mechanized silkscreen prints that moved and overlapped as the viewer interacted with them. His groundbreaking techniques in printmaking are now considered standard practice. Through screen printing, Rauschenberg found an avenue for his personal anguish at the news. He termed the collective currents project the, quote, most serious journalism I had ever attempted, end quote. And he acknowledged in an interview, quote, if I could write, I would be a journalist. I would report on the world and try to get people to take responsibility, but I can only be an artist, end quote. So I'd like to invite Seth Prince to talk with us and to join and share his perspective about Rauschenberg's work and time period. Welcome, Seth.
Thank you. Glad to be here. I think this is a fascinating time in media. And I was kind of making some notes as we were talking through this, and you'll see some examples here on screen of pages from the OU Daily. And at some point, we may also show you a few from Sooner Yearbook, which was the longtime yearbook here at OU. And these are drawn from around the same time that Rauschenberg was creating currents. One of the questions we were talking about before the program began was, what would this look like in today's world if someone were creating something like this? I wonder if Banksy might be an example in the context of some of the pieces he's created that kind of press social issues of the day into the forefront of people's experiences. There was one even a couple of years ago that I was just looking up called Girl with a Balloon, that sold for like $1.4 million. And it's just a silhouette of a girl with a balloon. And kind of looking at the lack of perspective that I think we can have in media today. When it was auctioned, it literally dropped through a shredder and immediately was destroyed in the moment, to kind of play with the audience in that space and where our priorities are and what we're focusing upon. Some of the examples you see here in the Daily, you see headlines like "America might be dying." This was a letter from a freshman at OU. We don't run many letters to the editor anymore, but I was reading through this just a bit ago. Some of the things that we saw in the 1970s, I think we're seeing again today, and how that's reflected in our journalism, whether it be letters to the editor, whether it be video projects, whether it be front pages. I think it's just a really fascinating time. In that letter to the editor about America might be dying, one of the lines says, "Fortunately, there are many wise and concerned people in this society who might be able to bring their talents to bear in making America a better place to live. Unfortunately, they presently lack the political power to be effective, but they are learning the ropes and their power is growing." Working with students every day on campus, as I do here at the Daily, I feel like that is something we're still living in, certainly have been living in recent years. And I guess in the pressing news context of the title of this exhibit, I think it's interesting to consider in 1970 what had gone on in 1969 and what was coming with Watergate. And I think there's this fascinating dimension of media where we're pretty tradition bound in the legacy spaces, but these forces for change and creativity and innovation bubble up, as I think you could make the case you see here with Rauschenberg. But they're often, I found it really interesting that the critics thought he wasn't creative enough, that he didn't put enough of an imprint on things in his own way. But I guess I would wonder, some of the journalism that's being created today and like maybe an augmented reality space, I almost wonder if we were to cover the Oklahoma City bombing today, how would we tell those stories differently? How would we make those stories more immersive for people to experience in a more visceral way than simply words on a page?
That's interesting. Do you have any ideas about that, Seth?
I think we're seeing it in bigger news organizations where they have many, many more resources. Some of the work in Ukraine has utilized more virtual reality spaces, taking people back through cities where atrocities were committed and literally giving you the experience of walking down a street. And then turning and seeing, this space in a yard where X number of people were massacred. I think that those are new ways of storytelling, just like in some regards, I think Rauschenberg was looking at the tragedies of, his era and really pushing the story to really disrupt the status quo. I think it's easy to sort of, I was talking with students literally yesterday about just kind of the weight of the news and the heaviness and almost depressing aspect that it can feel like it takes a toll on us at times. And I think sometimes we as media makers fall into a little bit of a rut with just telling the stories the same way. And I feel like Rauschenberg was really kind of thrashing against that. And taking some of those imagery and pushing them into more formats that you couldn't help but see, like the dead fish, in the newspaper, with the fish wrap dimension of that. So yeah, I think there's it's a fascinating time to see the evolution of media, and I think particularly how legacy media sometimes is the place where there isn't as much innovation. And how, whether it be, on a very, very small scale, college media, whether it be startup.com media, I look at literally this week, the seeming demise of Twitter and the impacts that has in people's media consumption, and what might come next if it really does fall apart, and how could that be maybe a better experience to enrich civic understanding.
Do you have any predictions of what that might, I mean,
I think if I was great at predictions, I might be working somewhere other than the advisor for the OU Daily. But, you know, I think it's, I guess I'd be curious from the audience perspective, you know, is there fatigue with media as it has been? I think it's a really interesting time to see, you know, historically at the beginnings of American media, it was much more partisan. And then we drifted to much more of a centrist space where it was just the facts and the concepts of objectivity. And certainly in the digital disruption, I think it's sort of splintered back into more of a factions of, you know, I like this media because they amplify the points I want to hear. And I guess I'm really curious to see what more shared platforms may emerge in the future that there is consensus around. I feel like, you know, something like Twitter, something like Facebook have just turned in these echo chambers where people hear what they want to hear. And I think one of the kind of sad losses of some of the old ways of doing it is, you know, there's not necessarily that shared set of facts that people can congregate around any longer in some ways.
you had, last week when we talked, you had mentioned this term moral clarity in journalism. And
Right.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. That was not, I mean, I think I understand the idea, but it wasn't really, I didn't realize that that was kind of an
Sure.
objective of journalism.
Yeah. So in most journalism schools, including here at OU, the concept of objectivity is still kind of a hallmark of how journalists are trained. That's a long-standing tradition. I think, don't know the kind of the background of everybody here on the call, but for many people of a certain generation, Watergate was this defining moment of what journalism could be. And I think in many capacities, we still see that influencing our students today. Woodward and Bernstein were literally speakers at a college media conference in DC about 2 weeks ago, championing the stories that they did all those decades ago. But the concept of moral clarity is something that really has emerged through a reporter named Wesley Lowery. He was a reporter also at the Washington Post, as obviously were Woodward and Bernstein. But the concept of that is really rooted in stepping back and asking ourselves if anybody truly is objective. You know, can we divorce ourselves from all the realities and experiences of our life and come to tell a story in some pure state? Conceptually, I understand the premise of it, but I think increasingly people like Lowery are suggesting that it is impossible to set aside all of the influences that have shaped us through our lives and our experiences. And so he instead has a premise of more being transparent with the audience about his background, his life experiences, and how that may influence his work. But he also put, you know, a lot of his work has been in the capacity of racial unrest and specifically police interactions with communities of color. And his reporting would suggest that we need not always feel the compulsion to fall into what's commonly now known as both sidesism. Like, for example, if you go back and you look at the Minneapolis police communications in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's death, there was an indication from that source that this was a fairly routine police interaction. And obviously, when you look at the totality of the evidence that ultimately came out, it was anything but. But in the both sidesism of the old way of media, you would interview the person on the street, you would interview the police, you would give them equal weight. And Lowery's perspective is that both sides may not always deserve equal measure.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So how is that playing? I mean, so that's playing out now in news media now. That there, do you see like there's an abandoning of this attempt to give both perspectives? Maybe
I think we're living in a state of transition in that regard. You know, we have alums who come back who work at places like the Washington Post. they're kind of on the front lines of that debate. An example that I would share with folks here that I think I use with our students regularly, it has traditionally been the capacity or the premise of most media organizations that journalists would not take part in protest. Just that it would be perceived as not objective, it would skew people's perspective of the coverage and feel like there's bias coming into play. And people here could very well have differences of opinion on this example, but several years ago, just for context, the Daily students are independent. I'm here as an advisor to offer them support and institutional perspective and professional best practices, but they make their coverage decisions in their independence. And that's been the case since 1916 when the Daily started. But there was a women's march early in the Trump era, and it was getting a lot of discussion through the political lens of the moment. And the editor-in-chief at the time, who was, probably 19, 20 years old, came in and said, this is a women's march. I'm getting questions from my staff as to whether we have any members of our staff that could just go to it as participants, not necessarily as journalists. And I'm thinking through the pros or cons or ramifications of that. And so we talked it out, and there was a lot of, at that point of the Trump administration, a lot of, again, escalating political tensions. And in the end, that student leader asked her staff to hew to the standard traditions of the past and not to go to that unless they were covering it. But as that student leader and her colleagues and her staff at large looked at the aftermath of that, they came away with the perspective that most of what was being discussed about that would be equal rights for women rather than something that was more politically pointed in some way. And so they kind of had a moment of remorse as to were they keeping their staff from participating in something that wasn't going to damage their journalism. And since then, we've had some really interesting conversations with Gaylord leadership and deans about how to manage those situations. And now we take it a little bit more on a case-by-case basis, which puts a little bit more onus onto the students to navigate the ethics of which protest, which rally, which event might be safe to go to versus too political to go to. But I think Rauschenberg here is leaning more into obviously the political ramifications of it than a traditional journalist would. But I think journalism today is in this very rapid state of evolution in which these sorts of manifestations are things students are living with in their coverage decisions and journalists are living with in their coverage decisions every day. Also, I love this headline, Poet Predicts 1970 Nervous Breakdown. I feel like the past few years that we've lived through have maybe been an equivalent of that in society, and to see, how history repeats itself in many ways. So.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that when I was working on the exhibition last spring. At some point, Rauschenberg said he couldn't believe anybody would go on summer vacation in 1970 because the news was so bad. How could you, how could you go on vacation? And as we were starting to work on this project, it was when all the news was coming from Ukraine about the invasion. And I thought, I understand his sentiment, and I think that he maybe understands our time. Especially on the heels of the pandemic in the past several years.
Yeah, I think in some ways, and again, this may be a perspective around which people can have differences of opinion, but I think many journalists get into this business because they want to do something to better society, whether that be on a super local level, like the University of Oklahoma and this campus, whether that be a metro level as the Oklahoman or the Tulsa World, or whether that be on a national or global level. And I think there is a constant struggle. There's a quote that you had on the screen earlier about make them look and react. One of the things we think about in journalism is if you read a great story and no one reads it, no one reacts to it, nothing comes as a consequence of it, was it necessarily a great story? What is the purpose of journalism? And is it to inform, or is it also in some ways perhaps to, in some moments, help inspire change? And I think his art was sort of thrashing against the realities of the late 60s and early 70s in an attempt where maybe people were tuning out a little bit. The 1969 was before my time, but, you know, kind of the dynamics of the, you know, the hippie era and 69 and the summer of love and all those things where people were, I guess maybe in the context of Vietnam, protesting things in deeper ways. Kind of a good segue here. This is the 1971 Sooner Yearbook. This is the opening spread, and that's, I think, literally as you open the book to the first page, these are the things that you would see. The whole opening sequence of this book is kind of like this trippy experience that is very unlike most yearbooks that you would see if you went over to Bazell and pulled, you know, the 110 editions off the shelf and thumbed through them through the years. Over there on the side, you have what was known as Little Red, which was the university's mascot. Some of you might be familiar with in the 60s and I think into the early 1970s. That was a mascot that had been around for a while. You know, my uncle was one of the first members of my family to go to college at all and was a student here, and our family is Choctaw, and as he was a student at the university, he was asked whether he would like to be Little Red. He had a very strong reaction that no, he had no interest in that. And, you know, I've had the good fortune of getting to know a little bit Dr. Henderson. And Dr. Henderson tells the story that when he came to OU in the 1960s and went to a football game and saw this mascot running around the field, he kind of turned to the people around him and was like, really? Is that normal here? And that, as he has explained it, generated some conversations which ultimately led to Little Red being abolished. But this in 1970 was a time in which that was coming to a head. Obviously, right next to that, you can see a guy with a joint and then an African-American student leader on campus. This opening sequence, in part, I think, because of the depiction of marijuana there, as it's been explained to me through the years, the regents were very unhappy with the opening spreads of this yearbook. And I have a copy in my office, but if you ever find one in a flea market or on eBay or, you know, wherever you might, if you go looking for such things, the story is that the regents ordered the books to be returned and the opening spread be removed from the book because it was too controversial, too political for their approval in the ultimate structures of student media, where the students are independent, but the regents are the ultimate authority. And this is one of the few instances through our history in which the regents came down with a heavy hammer and said that that had to be removed. So from what I understand, you'll find many books in which these opening spreads are gone, and a few books in which they were preserved, you know, for others to find.
Wow. And you said 1971, so I have the wrong caption on there. This is the 1971 yearbook.
Yeah, 1971 Sooner.
Wow. Well, I think I would like to invite our audience to participate if they're interested in this discussion. And Amanda, are you coming back on? You can
Sure. Oh my gosh, while you guys were talking, it was really hard for me to not just jump on and chime in. We've had so many conversations so far already, but I feel like we don't have the same conversation twice about the same work. So we'll go ahead and get the Q&A started now. So if anybody has any questions or comments, go ahead and please feel free to type those into the chat and I will relay those to Hadley and Seth. But I do have, I don't even know if this is much of a question, but sort of like this thought, and I've had it for a while actually, since the exhibition went up, but I keep thinking about kind of like the disposable nature of the news, which I think is something that Rauschenberg was really talking about, you know, where, and even just in the physicality of it, right? Like we use newspapers to wrap objects, and like once you read it, it's then, I don't even know what happened. It kind of like disappears, right? In some, it doesn't disappear, but you know what I'm saying. It disappears from our attention to it. And I think it's really interesting that Rauschenberg was trying to call our attention back, you know, like don't just wrap your garbage in it. Don't just put it in the trash. And in doing that, he took those headlines and made them into fine art objects that you can't just discard. So I don't really know where my question is, but it's just this thought that keeps coming to me. And I'm on a personal level, like Seth, I'm just kind of wondering, as a journalist, what is that like? Like, I can't look at recycling now the same. When I see a newspaper in there, it hits me different than I never even used to think about it before. I'm just wondering, like, as a journalist, you know, you spend all this time you're researching and you're writing and you have these stories, and then to just kind of see it discarded. I don't know, does that resonate in any way, or is there a disconnect there? I don't know.
I think it does, and it's fascinating for me. You know, I came through OU as a student when we still had a daily newspaper to produce. That was one of my jobs when I was a student at the Daily, was designing the paper every night. And our students today, in the past few years, have really lobbied to make changes based upon the fact that we would see not a ton of our copies of the newspaper picked up around campus. They have strenuously lobbied and successfully lobbied for us to be much more digitally focused. And on one level, when we have major news events, we still have that luxury at our disposal to do a special edition. You know, if a president retires, if a major event happens on campus, if there's a tornado that hits town or something like that. But I think for me, and I think for journalists of an older generation, we are in that state of transition where we are attached to something that was just the format of the time. But today's students, the format at the time, that doesn't occur to them. You know, the idea that we would literally print something on a newspaper, work through the night, throw it in your driveway and expect you to go out in the dark and pick it up and read it, as opposed to just picking this up and reading what you need, seems a little, you know, distant for where we are today. You know, even my 70-something father-in-law, who is a diehard print reader, has finally made the leap to reading the e-edition of the Oklahoman. He still grouses about it, and he still is very disgruntled about the print paper not always showing up on time in his driveway. But to me, it all illustrates that at the end of the day, you know, the message is what's important. You know, whether it's in newsprint, whether it's in a magazine, whether it's in a yearbook, whether it's on Twitter, you know, is your message important enough to resonate, is what I think we have to, as journalists, think more deeply about, rather than the format that it comes across in.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's the story itself has a life of its own beyond whatever format it is conveyed in, right? And that's how it lives. Interesting to think about. Hadley, I have someone is asking if you can go back to the 1971 yearbook entry slide. Thank you. Appreciate it. We can just leave it here for a moment for our audience member to take a look at that. I do have a few comments to relay to you all. So let's see. We have an audience member who was saying a little bit ago that we can have little civic understanding until we put the teaching of civics back into the public middle school and high school curriculum. Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that.
I would add to that. I mean, one of the things I think we're struggling with today is media literacy. I think as media has fractured into so many places, people's understanding of it has really been diminished. I think one of the challenges we have for student journalists going forward is just educating people on what we do and why we do it. So many people just are that is foreign to them in some really fascinating but difficult ways to have our work be understood effectively.
Absolutely. I have a question for both of you. Whoever wants to answer. But you were talking earlier about objectivity, and we've talked, the three of us, a little bit about neutrality before. And so I'm wondering, in your opinion, Seth and Hadley, do you think that Rauschenberg was he trying to work with any kind of neutrality, or do you think that was not even really a consideration while creating these images?
I can take a stab at that. But actually, I think my stab is based on our colleague Karen's experience putting together the headlines that are in the gallery in the learning and engagement space. And Karen could talk for herself. I don't want to have to talk. I don't want to talk for you, Karen. So you can say this if you like, instead of me saying it. But she was really making an effort to make sure that the headlines and the articles she included in the learning and engagement space that people could interact with were balanced. I mean, that they were from a variety of sources, and found it really difficult in a way to do that, because it was almost like the newspapers, the material led her to select certain objects, I guess. Correct me if I'm wrong, Karen. But I think when we look at Rauschenberg's prints, and the docents, when they visited the gallery, they kind of they did this too. There are certain themes that come up over and over again. It's environmentalism, it's Vietnam, politics, marijuana comes up again and again. And so in a way, I think that he was definitely finding what he was looking for to some extent, but there's also a lot of humor in those images, but it's subtle. And there's also an emphasis on sports, which is not necessarily a negative, it doesn't have the same, those images don't have the same negative connotation as some of the others. But I found it interesting that critics thought that he was not manipulating the images enough. He was not kind of imposing his own will as an artist on the images enough, when to me, there's such a clear thematic consistency across the prints. Does that answer your question, Amanda?
Yeah.
I mean, Seth, please.
I think in a way you could, art is not my area of expertise. I want to completely emphasize, but in a way, I think he's taking in some capacities what journalists still do, which is this piece of information and this piece of information, and he's just juxtaposing them in ways that tell a story a little bit differently than when this headline is over here and that headline is over there. He's almost sourcing the story in a more creative way to leave you with a different impact than when these things are disparate and separated. And I think that's what journalists do. I think he, in many capacities, you could define him as a journalist, just working in a new format for his time.
Oh, that's interesting. He probably would have liked to hear that.
That's what I was just gonna say. Let's see, we have a few more comments. Okay, so someone else has mentioned that we need more attention on professional media and less on the unexamined, unaccountable social media aspects, which I think when you were mentioning Twitter earlier, like, with the dissolution of that, if that happens, that will be interesting to see where it goes.
Yeah, I think that's, again, thinking of the 1970s legacy media, the fact that you would have, ABC, NBC, or CBS as really your primary television news sources, and you had these three predominant voices that, informed society. One of the wonderful things that has happened in the digital disruption is that so many more voices are available, but yet we don't have as much clarity on which ones to trust. And I hope in the aftermath of Twitter or wherever we go next, I think it's just a fascinating time for media to figure out how to be trusted.
Absolutely, which actually leads into this last comment that we have here. Someone has mentioned that the news has also been construed to include rumors and innuendos rather than facts. It goes along with exactly what you were just saying. Well, we're just about at the hour. Does anybody have any last questions or comments? Otherwise, I'll go ahead and wrap up our program. Going once, going twice. Type fast. Okay. All right, everybody. Well, I would like to thank so much Hadley and Seth for sharing your interest, your research, and your insights into this fascinating body of work. Robert Rauschenberg Pressing News is currently on view in the museum, will be up until February 26th. So you still have time to see the exhibition in person. And I believe there's a link in the chat now to see it virtually. Thank you also to Yellow Dog Coffee Company for creating such a delicious roast for this program. We're truly enjoying working with you all and appreciate your support of Coffee with the Collection. And of course, thank you to our audience members for joining us this morning. We hope you enjoyed our conversation, and don't forget to join us again for the next Coffee with the Collection in January. Keep an eye on your inbox. I'll send an email to everyone about that next session soon. So thank you, everybody. Have a lovely holiday season. We'll see you in the new year. Have a
Thank
great
you all.
weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.